Thank you. Well, I was struck by what Eugenia and Julia said, which is you can't say you don't know. I mean, I think a lot of what people in this room are doing, what I am trying to do, is say, I have lived in my life through periods of silence about any number of issues, from cancer, menstruation, menopause, violence, sexual trafficking, domestic violence. All of these things we've been encouraged at different points, and this is true around the world, to basically stay stum. And this is so unfair and leaves people so lonely and so isolated. And once any of us have a voice, and obviously I got a voice, a big voice, as soon as I was having some platform in the arts, it's really important to think, how do we use our voice to tell not just our story, but other people's stories? And I think that's what you've stressed, really, that in the end, it's storytelling, which is at the very root of us as humans. We need to tell stories, we need to hear stories from other people, and that's what changes our hearts, and then our minds get involved. It isn't usually the other way around. And one of the things that I always say, slightly humorously, is that 8 years ago when I started the WOW Women of the World Festival, I decided I would come out as a woman. Obviously, you know, I am a woman, and that's obvious, but and even though I've always supported women and women's rights, I think there's a difference between that and really refusing any longer to maintain a kind of complicit politeness around some of the issues, which, as Helena said this morning, you just get impatient. You get impatient for change. And I applaud all the young women who particularly are now saying time's up on a number of things. I don't think that's audacious in the wrong way. I think it's audacious in the right way. And for those of different generations who, I think I'll use the word groomed, who get groomed, and the men too, into thinking this is what good behaviour looks like. When you actually step back and say, how can we say that in the face of this level of exploitation and inequality? That can't be what being proper looks like. So it's an amazing time, I think, for all of us as the world suddenly takes a lurch into the future for the better. Because this is an issue of human potential, which is why this nexus of entrepreneurs, business, government, policy making, and grassroots society are coming together. Because if you think, as I do, that over 50% of the world's human potential has somehow been resisted, it's been held back because it's been sort of normalized to try to make it smaller than it is. Women's potential is as huge as men's. Then actually this is a time when we can't squander that potential any longer. Just from a GDP point of view, we can't squander it. In human rights, we can't squander it. Human joy, we can't squander it. And I think this is a time of great change, and it's very exciting because we're exchanging silence for witnessing and speaking out. And that is the thing. So when I said earlier in the green room, for all the women and men who don't speak out, they silently agree that this all should be happening, but they're not doing anything about it themselves. I think that is being part of the problem. Nobody in this room is going to be of that persuasion, otherwise you wouldn't be all here on a Monday or Tuesday morning. So the WOW Festival, just to put it in context, and just to say, first of all, this is not the Women in the World Festival, which Tina Brown very successfully runs in New York. Just want to make that distinction. We both started at more or less the same time with an irritatingly similar title. But since I began Women of the World 8 years ago, it's now, to my amazement and occasionally alarm, developed to become what AOL has said is the largest gathering of women in the world. Over 2 million women have now taken part in the Women of the World Festival. It's in every place from Beijing, Karachi, Kathmandu, Bradford, Norwich, Istanbul about to open, Rio about to open. We're just looking at a refugee camp in Iraq, one of the largest refugee camps there, Fiji, Malaysia, Tonga, etc. And we've just done the WOW Festival as part of the Commonwealth Games. And the reason why I think it is so popular is because it is, as you say, built on story. Ordinary girls and women telling stories of everything from the most extreme trauma to the most wonderful triumphs. Women don't want to be placed into the victim box. Women have been achieving extraordinary things throughout the whole of history. The fact that it is badly documented and sometimes invisible doesn't mean it hasn't been happening. And one of the great campaigns I'm about to launch with Sandy Toksvig and Jimmy Wales is, how do we get Wikipedia, the great new encyclopedia of the world that has so little entries for women? How do we stop history yet again suggesting that women just weren't there. That's a real issue. But for me, we need to celebrate what girls and women are doing and commemorate what they have done. And that gives you the stamina and the optimism to make change. Because when we're talking about things like slavery, modern-day slavery, we're looking at some of the most barbaric examples of human cruelty. And we can't let that make us passive because we feel, in the end, overwhelmed by it. If we didn't think that girls and women were not equal, we wouldn't have these scales of violence. I mean, we have to look at it as something that is deeply, deeply ingrained, because not all disrespect leads to violence, but violence always comes from disrespect. And there is an umbilical cord that goes from boys being told at primary school, don't be like a girl. As soon as you have that in your head as a boy, don't be like a girl, you know that your duty in life is to make yourself better than a girl. You've got to be able to prove that somehow. That is a terrible burden to put on boys. But the result of that, in a systemic way, is that they then find different ways of demonstrating that they can have power over girls, agency over girls, brutalize girls, or even just be mildly sexist when they don't even want to be in front of their friends. So there's all sorts of ways that boys and men get entrapped into this same story of difference. And one of the things that WOW does in bringing imams to the table, in bringing priests to the table, is also talk about how theology reinforces over and over again the stories of difference, the stories of inequality. How do we take all our world stories and rethink them? Even in the arts, when you think about those first handprints on the Great Walls paintings 35,000 years ago, we don't know whether they were painted by men or women. Maybe both. Let's say it was the women with their dyes painting those pictures. But how is it then that we've managed to take one of the great fundamental needs of humans, which is to make art, and say that actually, broadly speaking, only men are geniuses, and women basically do the cooking and the sweeping up afterwards, and nurse the babies in the corner of the caves? I mean, that is part of storytelling change that we're going to have to make. So whether we're in Hargeisa, which is really a place of very great difficulty now in Somaliland in terms of restricting women's growth, or whether we're in a place like Tonga dealing with the relationship of women and climate change, or whether we're in a place like Bradford where young girls are really reclaiming that city and naming it City of Youth. All of that really is going to be about how girls and women feel excited about making change and feel brave enough to be honest. And when I started a parallel festival called BAM, Being a Man, a few years ago, it was because I wanted boys and men to also catch up with the conversation. I think that's really critical. This is not about assisting women to be equal. This is about having real skin in the game about a different order of society. And men have been ruled out of conversations because A, they felt they weren't needed, or they didn't need it. And actually neither is true. They are needed, they are loved, but also there's an enormous language. I mean, any minority group, well, women aren't a minority, but you know what I mean, minority rights, they have to develop language for what change should look like. They have to imagine change, they have to describe it, and they have to be able to describe what inequality currently looks like. And traditionally, boys and men have not had to do that if they have come from a fairly privileged context. That's got to change because we need to have shared language. So finally, in thinking about how all our stories unite, the stories of terrible trauma and the stories of great triumph, I think it's because we are now going to reinvent a new set of stories together. That's what the Sustainable Development Goals are about, a new set of stories. And it's frightening for me and exciting to think I'm going to be part of that change too. Thanks.